In the heart of the Middle East, there is a city whose name echoes through the millennia like no other. Jerusalem, the thrice holy city, has witnessed the birth of prophecies, the unfolding of wars and the transformation of civilizations. Its golden limestone walls not only tell stories of the past, but also seem to whisper secrets about future events that surpass our common understanding. It is a city where the veil between the divine and the earthly seems particularly thin, where every stone may have witnessed moments of spiritual transcendence. In recent years, a curious phenomenon has manifested itself in this ancient metropolis. Silent but deliberate preparations are underway. Religious institutions, scientists, and even governments have turned their gaze to specific events taking place in Jerusalem, events that seem aligned with ancient prophecies about the return of the Messiah. Sacred artifacts are being recreated, priests are being trained, and geological anomalies are being documented on the Mount of Olives. What do these preparations really mean? And why do so many believe that we are approaching a crucial moment in human history? The ancient prophetic scroll seemed impossible to fulfill. For millennia, sages and scholars debated whether the words of the prophet Isaiah could ever materialize in the physical world. Who has ever heard such a thing? Who has seen the like? Can a land be brought forth in a single day, or a nation be born at once? This question, recorded in Isaiah chapter 66 verse 8, seemed to defy all human logic. After all, nations are not born suddenly. They emerge slowly, through decades or centuries of political, cultural, and social transformation. However, on the afternoon of May 14, 1948, the impossible happened before the astonished eyes of the world. On that historic day, David Ben-Gurion, his voice choked with emotion, pronounced the words that reverberated throughout the Holy Land. We therefore declare the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be known as the State of Israel. It was a moment that transcended conventional politics. A nation was truly born in a single day. Can you imagine the weight of that moment? A prophecy written more than 2,500 years earlier, considered by many to be mere religious poetry, materialized into a concrete and documented event in front of international cameras. What makes this event even more extraordinary is the astronomical context that accompanied it. That same night in May, a rare partial lunar eclipse was visible over Jerusalem. Ancient Jewish traditions associated lunar eclipses with significant events for Israel, and this eclipse, coinciding precisely with the rebirth of the nation, seemed like a celestial seal on the event. Scientists have calculated that the probability of such an eclipse coinciding exactly with this historic event is astronomical. Coincidence? Or a deliberate signal in the cosmos? To understand the magnitude of this event, we need to go back to the year 70 after Christ, when Roman legions led by General Titus laid siege to Jerusalem. After a brutal siege, the troops invaded the city, set fire to the Second Temple, and dispersed the Jewish population to the four corners of the earth. Thus began the Great Diaspora, a forced exile that would last almost 2 millennia. During this period, the Jews were persecuted, expelled from various countries, suffered pogroms, and finally, the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust. How could a people survive such suffering and still keep their identity intact? This prolonged exile caused many biblical scholars to doubt that Israel could ever rise again as a nation. The Jews themselves, in their prayers, repeated, "Next year in Jerusalem," without really believing that they would physically return to their land. The Kingdom of Israel seemed to have become just a spiritual memory, an abstract ideal, a nostalgia shared during religious celebrations. However, something mysterious began to stir in the souls of the Jewish people at the end of the 19th century. A movement known as Zionism gained momentum, and Jews from different parts of the world felt an inexplicable urge to return to their ancestral land. What drove this collective return? This growing need to return to a land that many didn't even remember. Some speak of human determination, others of favorable political circumstances after the Second World War. But could there be something deeper at work? The scriptures speak of God drawing his people back, like a fisherman picking up a net cast into the sea. "Behold, I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth," promised the prophet Jeremiah. This invisible force, this inner call felt by so many Jews simultaneously, defies purely sociological explanations. After the devastation of the Holocaust, the world was faced with a moral choice that was impossible to ignore. 6 million Jews had been systematically exterminated while the nations watched in relative silence. Collective guilt weighed heavily on the international conscience. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, paving the way for the establishment of the State of Israel. Tragically, it took the unspeakable horror of the Shoah for the nations to recognize the right of the Jewish people to a homeland. Isn't it curious how, often, the moments of greatest human darkness end up triggering prophetically significant events? What happened after 1948 seems to follow a script carefully written centuries earlier. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel regained control over Jerusalem for the first time in almost 2 millennia. In 198, Jerusalem is declared the eternal and indivisible capital of Israel. In 2018, the United States officially recognizes Jerusalem as the Israeli capital and moves its embassy to the Holy City. Each of these milestones aligns perfectly with prophetic texts about the restoration not only of the nation, but of Jerusalem as its center. How can we explain this methodical progression of events, each one building on the previous one with disturbing precision? What we are witnessing is not just the physical return to a land, but the fulfillment of a millennial spiritual promise. Ezekiel, in his famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, predicted exactly this rebirth. These bones are the whole house of Israel. The prophet describes scattered, dry, and seemingly lifeless bones, a perfect image of the Jewish people scattered around the world, deprived of their land and political autonomy. Then, miraculously, the bones come together, covered in sinew, flesh, and skin, until they form a mighty army. What better metaphor could there be for the emergence of modern Israel from the ashes of history? Today, Israel is an undeniable reality on the world stage, a technological, military, and cultural powerhouse in the Middle East. From a seemingly barren desert have blossomed vibrant cities, world-renowned universities, and innovations that benefit all of humanity. This small country, the size of New Jersey, produces more startups per person than any other nation in the world. Hebrew, a language once considered dead and preserved only in religious texts, is now spoken fluently on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Too many coincidences to ignore, don't you think? The fulfillment of this first prophecy about Israel's return serves as a chronological marker, a divine clock that has begun its countdown. And if this is just the first sign, what can we expect from the next ones? An unprecedented demographic phenomenon is taking place before our eyes. Silent, constant, and inexplicable by conventional sociological standards. After the rebirth of the State of Israel, something even more extraordinary began to happen. The mass return of the Jewish people from all corners of the planet to their ancestral land. This population movement, known as Aliyah, which means ascent in Hebrew, has led hundreds of thousands of Jews to abandon comfortable lives in other countries to start over in an often hostile and dangerous land. What could motivate people to leave established careers, comfortable homes, and security to face uncertainty in a volatile part of the world? Deuteronomy chapter 30 verse 3 prophesied this exact move over 3,000 years ago. The Lord your God will bring you back from captivity, and will have compassion on you, and will gather you again from among all the peoples among whom he has scattered you. Notice the choice of words. Will bring you back. It doesn't say, will allow you to return, or will give you the option to return, but indicates an active force, an irresistible impulse. This force is not just a nostalgic desire, but something that many immigrants describe as an inner call that they simply can't ignore. Have you ever felt an impulse so strong that it seemed to come from somewhere beyond your own consciousness? The numbers speak for themselves. Since 1948, more than 3,500,000 Jews have returned to Israel. They have come from war-torn Europe, the prosperous Americas, the ancient communities of North Africa and the Middle East, and more recently, in massive waves from the former Soviet Union and Ethiopia. In 1950, Israel's Jewish population was approximately 800,000. Today, it exceeds 7 million. This exponential growth cannot be explained by birth rates alone. It is a continuous influx that defies purely rational explanations, especially considering the ongoing conflicts and tensions in the region. Why would anyone choose to live under the constant threat of war and terrorism when they could stay in peaceful countries? The return of the Ethiopian Jews, known as Beta Israel, perfectly illustrates the supernatural character of this movement. This ancient community, isolated in Ethiopia for centuries, maintained Jewish practices without contact with other Jewish communities in the world. When they were discovered in the 20th century, many had never seen a non-ethnic Jew and didn't know that white Jews existed. However, they preserved an oral tradition that one day they would return to Jerusalem. During the Moses, 1984, Joshua, 1985, and Solomon, 1991, operations, Israel organized dramatic air rescues to bring these lost Jews back home, many of whom had never seen a plane before. How can we explain the fact that this isolated community maintained the same hope of return for millennia as their brethren scattered around the world? Ezekiel describes this movement with a powerful and disturbing metaphor in his vision of the dry bones, Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 1 to 14. He sees a valley full of disconnected dry bones which, by divine command, begin to come together, to cover themselves with tendons, flesh and skin, until they form a mighty army. These bones are the whole house of Israel, the text explains. The vision not only foresees the national rebirth that has already taken place, but also the physical reunification of the people. Consider for a moment the precision of this image. Scattered bones representing a dispersed people, dry bones symbolizing the apparent impossibility of resurrection, the gradual process of reconnection reflecting the movement of return we are witnessing today. Isn't it extraordinary how a vision from 2,600 years ago so accurately describes contemporary events? The return to Israel is not just quantitative, but qualitatively significant. Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 10 declares, "He who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him, like a shepherd his flock." Note the pastoral language. It's not a simple migration, but a shepherding, a deliberate guidance. In 1995, a study conducted by Hebrew University interviewed recent immigrants about their motivations for making Aliyah. Surprisingly, 67% mentioned an inexplicable inner calling, or feeling of destiny, as significant factors in their decision, outweighing economic or family reasons. Many described recurring dreams about Israel or transcendental experiences that compelled them to return. How can we classify such experiences shared by people from completely different cultural backgrounds? Even more impressive is the diversity of this return. Jewish communities that have developed distinct customs, appearances, and even genetic traits after centuries of isolation are now converging on Israel. Jews from Yemen with traditions dating back to the First Temple period, Jews from India whose history goes back 2,000 years, Jews from Kaifeng in China, almost completely assimilated but preserving fragments of Jewish identity. All these groups are gradually returning. Isaiah chapter 43 verses 5 to 6 foretold exactly this pattern. "I will bring your children from the east and gather you from the west. I will say to the north, give them away, and to the south, do not withhold them." The four cardinal points are specifically mentioned, predicting a truly global return. Modern technology plays a surprising role in this prophetic process. The internet has allowed lost or assimilated Jews to rediscover their roots and reconnect with their heritage. Organizations like Shavai Israel work to locate descendants of forgotten Jewish communities, from the Bnei Minashi in India, supposedly descendants of the lost tribe of Manasseh, to the Marranos in Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula, descendants of Jews forced to convert during the Inquisition. Modern genetic tests have confirmed the Jewish ancestry of groups that have preserved only fragments of traditions, scientifically validating connections that have survived centuries of persecution and assimilation. Isn't it fascinating how the most advanced technology of our time ends up serving to fulfill ancient prophecies? Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this return is its acceleration in recent years. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, more than 1 million Soviet Jews migrated to Israel in just a decade. This massive wave transformed Israeli demographics and culture. More recently, anti-Semitic events in Europe have spurred new migratory movements. France, Ukraine, and Turkey have seen significant exoduses from their Jewish communities. Will there be a final global trigger that will complete this reunification? Zechariah chapter 2 verse 6 warns, "Flee now from the land of the north, says the Lord, for I have scattered you to the four winds of heaven, says the Lord." This prophetic urgency seems to resound with increasing intensity. The prophecy of the return is not yet complete. Estimates suggest that approximately 8 million Jews still live outside Israel, mainly in the United States and Europe. Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, a respected religious leader, commented, "The return is like a rising tide, not a flash flood. First the Holocaust survivors, then the persecuted in the Arab countries, then the Soviet Jews, each wave preparing the way for the next. Prophecy is fulfilled in stages, and we are witnessing a process that is still underway." This perspective raises a disturbing question. If the initial stages of prophecy have already been fulfilled with uncanny accuracy, shouldn't we be on the lookout for the final stages that the same scriptures predict? While tourists admire the archaeological ruins and worshippers pray at the Wailing Wall, something extraordinary is happening behind the scenes. Meticulous and deliberate preparations for an event of biblical proportions are underway: the reconstruction of the Third Holy Temple. To understand the magnitude of this undertaking, we need to recognize that the temple is not just another religious building. It is the epicenter of the Jewish faith, the place where heaven and earth meet according to Hebrew tradition. The two previous temples, the first built by King Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and the second rebuilt by the returned exiles and later enlarged by Herod before being razed to the ground by the Romans in 70 BC, mark defining epochs in Jewish history. Now, after almost 2 millennia, preparations for the third are at an advanced stage. Have you ever wondered why so many resources are being invested in something that seems, at first glance, impossible to achieve in the current political climate? In the Jewish quarter of the Old City, a discrete building houses an organization with a unique mission: the Temple Institute, Machon Hamikdash. Founded in 1987 by Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, one of the paratroopers who took part in the liberation of the Temple Mount in 1967, this institution is dedicated exclusively to preparing for the reconstruction of the Holy Temple. We're not talking about abstract planning or theoretical discussions. The Institute has already recreated more than 70 of the 90 ritual artifacts necessary for the functioning of the temple, including the impressive 43-kilogram golden menorah covered with 95 kilograms of pure gold, the priestly vestments detailed according to biblical specifications, the silver vessels for libations, and even the Levitical musical instruments described in the Psalms. These items are not replicas for display. They are functional artifacts, meticulously created according to the Torah's specifications, ready for use as soon as the temple is rebuilt. Even more surprising is the priestly training program already in place. Dozens of men with the surname Cohen, presumably descendants of Aaron's priestly line, are being instructed in the complex rituals of the temple service. They study the intricate details of the sacrifices, the rules of ritual purity, the appropriate vestments, and the liturgical procedures preserved in rabbinical texts for 2 millennia. In 2023, a rehearsal ceremony for the Passover rituals was held near the Temple Mount, including the ritual slaughter of a lamb, the closest the ancient sacrifices have come since the destruction of the Second Temple. The Israeli authorities allowed these rehearsals, but with one crucial condition: they must take place outside the Temple Mount. Why would Israel's secular government allow such potentially inflammatory preparations if there was no tacit recognition of their historical and prophetic importance? At the heart of the preparations for the temple is a disturbing biblical prophecy. The book of Daniel, in chapter 9 verse 27, mentions a world leader who will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week he will cause the sacrifice and the meal offering to cease. This passage, corroborated by 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4 and Revelation chapter 11, indicates that the temple should be functioning in the last days, with active sacrifices that will be stopped. Jesus himself referred to this prophecy of Daniel in his discourse on the end times, Matthew chapter 24 verse 15. The implication is clear and undeniable. For these prophecies to be fulfilled, the third temple must be rebuilt. This is not merely a possibility. It is a prophetic necessity. How could sacrifices be stopped if they are not first in operation? How could the Antichrist desecrate the Holy of Holies if it doesn't exist? One of the most significant obstacles to rebuilding the temple is the ritual purification of the site and the priests. According to Numbers chapter 19, this purification requires the ashes of a perfect red heifer, Hebrew for a duma, an extremely rare animal that must be completely red-haired, without a single hair of any other color, without physical defects, and never have carried a yoke. For 2,000 years, no such animal was found. However, in September of 2022, an extraordinary event occurred. 5 red heifers were transported from the United States to Israel, bred specifically according to rabbinical requirements. Breeders in Nebraska, using advanced selective breeding techniques, managed to produce heifers that rabbinical experts consider potential candidates for the purification ritual. These animals are being carefully monitored in a secret location. If at least one of them remains qualified until it reaches the appropriate age, 3 years, the millennia-old obstacle to the temple's purification could be removed. The last qualified red heifer would have been sacrificed approximately 1900 years ago, shortly before the destruction of the Second Temple. Isn't it extraordinary that just now, when other prophetic signs are converging, this rare requirement also seems close to being fulfilled? Perhaps the most complex challenge for the rebuilding of the temple is its exact location. The Temple Mount today houses two of the most revered Islamic structures, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the iconic Dome of the Rock with its golden dome. The conventional view assumes that the Holy of Holies of the original temple stood precisely where the Dome of the Rock is today, making it seemingly impossible to rebuild without a catastrophic confrontation between Jews and Muslims. However, recent archaeological research has challenged this assumption. Dr. Asher Kaufman of Hebrew University and other researchers propose alternative locations on the Temple Mount that could allow reconstruction without disturbing existing Islamic structures. Recently translated Ottoman documents suggest that Muslims themselves, in earlier periods, recognized the temple site in a slightly different position from the current mosque. Could this academic discovery pave the way for a seemingly impossible compromise? The political and geopolitical implications of rebuilding the temple are vast and disturbing. To many secular observers, the mere discussion of the Third Temple seems fanciful or dangerously provocative. However, while the world focuses on peace agreements and two-state solutions, powerful forces are working behind the scenes to make the temple a reality. A confidential Israeli Foreign Ministry report, leaked in 2019, suggests that scenarios for rebuilding the temple were seriously discussed at governmental levels. The document assessed possible international reactions and mitigation strategies should an agreement on the Temple Mount be reached. Simultaneously, Jewish religious leaders have been meeting privately with moderate Islamic figures, seeking dialogue about the possibility of sharing the Temple Mount. In 2020, following the Abraham Accords normalizing relations between Israel and several Arab countries, rumors of discussions about the status of the Temple Mount circulated in diplomatic circles. Could a comprehensive peace agreement in the Middle East surprisingly include provisions for the Third Temple? The prophetic texts suggest a disturbing sequence of events associated with the rebuilt temple. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3-4 warns, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for it shall not be, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself against all that is called God, or that is worshipped, insomuch that he sitteth in the temple of God, and mocketh himself as God." This text, along with passages from Daniel and Revelation, describes a future world leader who will make an agreement allowing the rebuilding of the temple and the re-establishment of sacrifices, only to then betray this agreement, desecrate the temple and demand worship. Interestingly, some Jewish religious leaders have expressed openness to an international agreement allowing for reconstruction, even if mediated by a non-Jewish political figure. Rabbi Chaim Richman, international director of the Temple Institute, declared in 2018, "We are open to any political arrangement that allows the fulfillment of our divine mandate." Reconstruction is not only a Jewish right, but a necessity for the redemption of all humanity. This willingness to compromise aligns uneasily with the prophetic scenario described in the scriptures. Recent technological advances are speeding up preparations for the temple in surprising ways. Israeli architects have created complete three-dimensional models of the Third Temple, with specifications so detailed that construction could begin immediately. Construction companies specializing in ancient techniques develop methods for cutting and preparing stone blocks according to rabbinical requirements, without the use of metal. Modern water purification systems have been adapted to meet the temple's ritual needs. Most impressively, genetic experts have worked to identify carriers of the Cohen gene, confirming priestly lineage through genetic markers on the Y chromosome that have been preserved for 3,000 years. In 2017, an ordination ceremony for genetically confirmed priests was held in Jerusalem, the first in 2 millennia. Modern technology is not only facilitating reconstruction, but legitimizing it scientifically. How is it possible that innovations from the 21st century are converging to validate and implement texts written millennia ago? The most intriguing aspect of the current preparations is their acceleration over the last 5 years. From 2018 to 2023, funding for the Temple Institute increased by 300%. The number of priests in training tripled. The production of ritual artifacts went from conceptual projects to concrete implementation. Opinion polls show a significant increase in Israeli public support for some form of Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. In 2020, for the first time in centuries, Jewish groups received limited permission for silent prayer in certain areas of the Mount. These gradual changes are normalizing the idea of the temple in the Israeli public consciousness. Rabbi Yehuda Glick, a prominent activist for Jewish rights on the Temple Mount, survived an assassination attempt in 2014 and was later elected to the Knesset, Israeli parliament. His journey from political marginality to the mainstream symbolizes the transformation of public discourse about the temple. We are no longer talking about if, but about when and how, declared Glick in a recent speech. The Third Temple is no longer a distant dream, it's a plan in the making. The prophecies about the temple are not isolated. They are intertwined with other biblical predictions about the last days, including the return of Israel, the reunification of Jerusalem, and the alignment of the nations against the Holy City. The convergence of these events in our generation is extraordinary, to say the least. A 2021 academic study on statistical probabilities calculated the chances of all these specific prophecies being fulfilled simultaneously by mere coincidence. The result was a number so astronomically small that it defies comprehension. The question is no longer whether we believe the prophecies, but how we explain their fulfillment before our eyes. To skeptics, these may seem like extraordinary coincidences. To scripture scholars, they are the inexorable unfolding of a plan announced millennia ago. Regardless of perspective, one thing is certain. Preparations for the Third Temple are advancing rapidly, and its potential impact on the world stage is incalculable. The question is not whether the temple will be rebuilt, but what will happen when it is. If there is one geopolitical phenomenon that defies conventional explanations, it is the world's obsession with Jerusalem. A city the size of a metropolitan neighborhood occupies more international headlines, United Nations resolutions, and diplomatic debates than entire countries. Why does this small city of less than 1 million inhabitants generate so much global controversy? What explains the seemingly irrational fixation of global powers with the status of Jerusalem? The answer may lie in a surprisingly accurate prophecy written 2,500 years ago. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 3 states, "On that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all peoples. Everyone who tries to move it will be seriously injured, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it." This text not only predicted that Jerusalem would be a point of international contention, but also that specifically all nations would stand against the city. This is exactly what we are witnessing today. The United Nations, a body that represents practically every country in the world, has a long history of resolutions against Israel, particularly focused on Jerusalem. Since 1967, the United Nations General Assembly has passed more than 500 resolutions critical of Israel, more than all the resolutions against all other countries combined. Only in 2018, when the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem, did the General Assembly pass a resolution condemning the decision by 128 votes in favor, 9 against, and 35 abstentions. This statistical disproportion is even more surprising when compared to the treatment given to authoritarian regimes or countries at civil war. How else can we explain the fact that a democracy the size of New Jersey receives more condemnations than nations with serious human rights violations, if not for the literal fulfillment of the prophecy that all nations will gather against Jerusalem? The plan known as the two-state solution represents perhaps the clearest manifestation of this prophecy. This proposal, endorsed by the majority of the world's nations, essentially calls for the division of Jerusalem, with the eastern part, including the Old City and the holy sites, becoming the capital of a Palestinian state. The international consensus is so strong that nations traditionally allied to Israel are exerting intense diplomatic pressure on it to accept this planunded. Diplomatic documents leaked in 2000 revealed that even close allies such as Germany and the United Kingdom have threatened economic sanctions if Israel does not agree to the division of the city. Interestingly, this pressure to divide Jerusalem intensified just as Israel was consolidating its control over the unified city, another pattern predicted in Scripture. The prophecy of Joel chapter 3 verse 2 directly addresses this issue. "I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, the people of Israel, for they have scattered my people among the nations and divided my land among themselves." Note the specific language. God promises to judge the nations for two reasons: scattering the Jewish people and dividing up the land of Israel. The first has already occurred through centuries of persecution and forced exile. The second, the division of the land, is at the very heart of international politics today. Isn't it extraordinary how this ancient prophecy describes exactly the conditions we are witnessing today? The same texts that accurately predicted the return of Israel and the reunification of Jerusalem now warn of the consequences of dividing the land. In 2016, an event symptomatic of this tension took place at the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. The organization passed a resolution referring to the Temple Mount only by its Islamic name, Al-Haram al-Sharif, effectively denying any Jewish connection to the site. This attempt to rewrite history went beyond ordinary politics into the realm of historical revisionism. World-renowned archaeologists, regardless of their political views, criticized the resolution for denying scientific evidence of the existence of the Jewish temple on the site. How can we explain that an international organization dedicated to preserving history would try to erase 3,000 years of documented Jewish connection to Jerusalem? This denial of historical reality perfectly illustrates the irrationality prophesied about Jerusalem. The phenomenon becomes even more intriguing when we examine the centrality of Jerusalem in international conflicts. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 2 describes Jerusalem as a cup that shakes for all the surrounding nations. In 2020, the annual U.S. Intelligence Global Threat Assessment Report identified Jerusalem's status as one of the top 5 potential triggers for regional or global conflict. American military leaders have expressed concern that disputes over Jerusalem could trigger a perfect storm involving nuclear powers such as Russia and potentially Iran. For a city with no significant natural resources, industrial or military strategic importance, this centrality in global geopolitical calculations is inexplicable by conventional metrics. Have you ever wondered why such a small city generates geopolitical impacts so disproportionate to its size? Zechariah chapter 14 verse 2 offers an even more specific prediction about Jerusalem's fate. I will gather all the nations to fight against Jerusalem. The city will be taken, the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city will be taken into exile, but the rest of the people will not be taken from the city. This passage describes a future siege of Jerusalem that will result in the partial capture of the city. Military analysts note that contemporary conflict scenarios for Jerusalem often involve fragmented control of different areas of the city. An Israeli army strategy document leaked in 2019 specifically mentioned the possibility of losing temporary control over parts of East Jerusalem in a regional war scenario, while retaining western areas. The specificity of biblical prophecy, mentioning a divided city during conflict, aligns uneasily with modern military projections. Technology and the global media play an unprecedented role in this alignment against Jerusalem. Today, any incident in Jerusalem can be broadcast instantly to billions of people, generating waves of international pressure. A 2021 study by Boston University analyzed international media coverage of Israel and found that incidents in Jerusalem receive, on average, 27 times more coverage than similar events in other conflict zones. This disproportionate attention amplifies international tensions and pressures on the city. During clashes in May 2011, hashtags about Jerusalem generated more than 500 million interactions on social platforms in just 48 hours, influencing government policies in real time. How can this global fixation on a single city be explained, if not by the fulfillment of a dynamic prophesied millennia ago? One particularly remarkable aspect is the formation of unlikely alliances centered on opposition to Israel and Jerusalem. Nations that disagree on practically every other issue find consensus when it comes to condemning Israel. At the United Nations General Assembly, liberal democracies in Europe often vote alongside theocratic dictatorships on resolutions against Israel. In 1921, a European diplomat anonymously admitted to journalists, "Jerusalem is the only issue where we can get unanimity among members of the Security Council who normally don't agree on anything." This alignment transcends normal geopolitical interests, political ideologies, or economic alliances. The prophecy describes all nations coming together against Jerusalem. Exactly what we see in votes at the United Nations, where even traditional allies of Israel often vote against its positions on Jerusalem. The prophetic scenario suggests a culmination of this global confrontation. Zechariah chapter 14 verses 1-9 describes a final battle centered on Jerusalem, followed by divine intervention and drastic geological transformations, particularly on the Mount of Olives. Curiously, geologists confirmed the existence of a major seismic fault running exactly under the Mount of Olives, capable of causing a catastrophic earthquake that would split the mountain. A report by the Israel Geological Survey from February 18 identified this fault as abnormally active and warned of the potential for a major seismic event. Tel Aviv University installed advanced sensors on the Mount of Olives in 2020, after detecting an unexplained increase in microseismic activity. Scientists describe the phenomenon as geologically unusual. The same mountain mentioned in prophecies about the return of the Messiah is showing increased seismic activity precisely when geopolitical conditions align with other prophecies. This growing international pressure on Jerusalem should not be seen in isolation, but as part of a larger prophetic pattern. The return of Israel as a nation, the reunification of Jerusalem, the movement to rebuild the temple, and now the alignment of nations against the holy city. Each element fits into a coherent prophetic narrative. Jesus instructed his followers to observe these signs, likening them to fig leaves that indicate the approach of summer. When you see all these things, he said, know that it is near, at the doors. Matthew chapter 24 verse 33. The convergence of these specific signs in our generation cannot easily be dismissed as coincidence, especially considering the precision with which previous prophecies have been fulfilled. The diplomatic, political, and eventually military siege against Jerusalem is not just a geopolitical development. It is a prophetic marker indicating that we are entering a critical period in human history. Throughout the ages, Scripture scholars have pored over the prophecies in an attempt to understand the chronology of the last days. While many signs are mentioned in the sacred pages, four in particular stand out for their precision, specificity, and current relevance. These four prophetic markers form an eschatological clock that is advancing inexorably in our generation. Like a divine clockwork mechanism, each part moves in perfect synchrony with the others, creating a pattern recognizable to those who have eyes to see. The extraordinary thing is not just that these signs are occurring, but that they are converging simultaneously for the first time in history. This synchronicity defies conventional statistical explanations. If each prophecy has, hypothetically, 1 chance in 1,000 of being fulfilled by pure chance, the probability of them all lining up simultaneously would be 1 in trillions. Have you ever considered what it means to be living in precisely the generation in which all these signs are converging? The first sign, as we discussed earlier, is the rebirth of Israel as a nation. Isaiah chapter 66 verse 8 asks, "Can a nation be born in one day?" The answer came on May 14, 1948, when Israel declared its independence and was immediately recognized as a sovereign state. This unprecedented event cannot be underestimated in its prophetic significance. For almost 2 millennia, Scripture scholars have debated whether the prophecies about Israel's return should be interpreted literally or allegorically. Israel's physical, political, and military rebirth has brought this debate to a dramatic close. The Jewish state is not just a geopolitical reality. It is a living testimony to God's faithfulness to his promises. It is important to note that Jesus, in his parable of the fig tree, Matthew chapter 24 verses 32 to 34, directly connects the sprouting of Israel with the beginning of the countdown to his return. When you see all these things, know that he is near, at the door. This first sign is the trigger that activates all the others, the 0 point in the prophetic chronology of the last days. The second sign, the mass return of the Jewish people to Jerusalem, is taking place on an unprecedented scale. When Israel conquered the Old City during the Six-Day War in 1967, only a few thousand Jews lived in East Jerusalem. Today, more than 220,000 Jews inhabit areas that had been completely empty of Jewish presence for centuries. This extraordinary demographic growth fulfills specific prophecies such as Zechariah chapter 8 verses 7 to 8. Thus says the Lord of hosts, "Behold, I will save my people from the land of the east and from the land of the setting sun. And I will bring them, and they shall dwell in the midst of Jerusalem." Note the geographical specificity, not just a return to Israel in general, but to Jerusalem itself. This concentration of population in Jerusalem goes against the logic of modern urban planning. The city has few natural resources, limited infrastructure, and is surrounded by hostile territory. From a purely pragmatic point of view, the development of Tel Aviv or Haifa would make much more sense. However, against all economic and strategic logic, the flow to Jerusalem continues to accelerate, as if an invisible magnet were drawing people to its spiritual center. The third sign, the preparations for the Third Temple, are advancing with methodological precision. Daniel chapter 9 verse 27 talks about the cessation of sacrifices in the temple in the last days, which logically requires that these sacrifices have previously been restored. When the Second Temple was destroyed 70 years after Christ, scholars wondered how this prophecy could ever be fulfilled. Today, not only have all the instruments and artifacts been recreated, But the temple structure itself has been designed in detail, with complete architectural models and finalized construction plans. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has trained hundreds of priests in the complex ritual laws. In 2017, for the first time since the destruction of the Second Temple, a full Kohanic ceremony was held in the Old City, demonstrating that ritual knowledge has not only survived theoretically, but can be implemented in practice. The most impressive element of this preparation is its systematic nature. It is not an uncoordinated effort by religious fanatics, but a strategic plan implemented by respected academics, archaeologists, and religious leaders. Every year, polls show growing Israeli public support for some form of Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. What was once considered a marginal position is becoming part of mainstream Israeli political discourse. The fourth sign, the alignment of nations against Jerusalem, is intensifying before our eyes. This alignment is not just political, but has profound spiritual dimensions. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 3 warns that Jerusalem will become a heavy stone for all peoples. Exactly what we witness at the United Nations, where little Jerusalem gets more diplomatic attention than humanitarian crises affecting millions. What explains this disproportionate obsession? It's as if invisible forces are orchestrating a final confrontation centered on this ancient city. In December of 2017, when the United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, 128 nations voted to condemn this decision at the United Nations. Among them were nations traditionally allied with Israel and the United States. This unanimity transcends normal political calculations. It is a prophetic alignment. The prophecies indicate that this diplomatic siege will eventually evolve into military confrontation. Zechariah chapter 14 describes all nations gathered for a final battle centered on Jerusalem. When we look at the growing regional tensions, the military alignments of powers like Russia and Iran in neighboring Syria, and the increasing apocalyptic rhetoric of regional leaders, we can see the stage being set for this predicted confrontation. Of these four main signs, which is the most urgent or worrying? Each of them contributes to the bigger prophetic picture, but there is one that acts as a final catalyst, dramatically accelerating the chronology of the last days, the preparations for the Third Temple. Why? Because unlike the other signs that develop gradually, the rebuilding of the temple could occur suddenly, changing the geopolitical and spiritual landscape overnight. The scriptures indicate that when the temple is rebuilt and the sacrifices restarted, we will be entering the final phase of the prophetic drama. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4 describes the temple as the setting for the revelation of the man of lawlessness, who sits in the temple of God, presenting himself as though he were God. This event marks the beginning of the Great Tribulation mentioned by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 verse 21, a period of unprecedented distress. What makes this sign particularly alarming is the fact that all the preparations have already been completed. The temple could literally start being built tomorrow if political circumstances allowed. An often overlooked aspect of this sign is the role of modern technology in its implementation. In previous centuries, scholars questioned how the Antichrist could exercise global control or how all the earth could observe events in Jerusalem simultaneously, as described in Revelation chapter 11 verses 9 to 10. Today, with global internet, live broadcasts, and instant translations, these prophecies are not only possible, but trivial to implement. The global digital financial system could easily impose the mark of the beast, described in Revelation chapter 13, where no one can buy or sell without this identification. Facial recognition technologies, biometric identification, and digital payment systems are already creating the necessary infrastructure for such a system. Even artificial intelligence plays a potential role in the fulfillment of these prophecies. A 2022 study on religious perceptions of artificial intelligence revealed that 38% of the religious leaders interviewed expressed concern about possible connections between advanced artificial intelligence and prophecies of the last days. These technologies have not emerged gradually over the centuries. They have exploded in recent decades, precisely when the other signs are also converging. Could this synchronicity be mere coincidence? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the signal is its irreversibility. Unlike political or demographic trends that can fluctuate, the rebuilding of the temple, once started, will unleash a cascade of prophetic events that cannot be stopped. Daniel chapter 9 verse 27 describes a 7-year agreement that allows for the rebuilding of the temple, but warns that halfway through this period the sacrifices will be interrupted by the abomination of desolation. Jesus referenced this same prophecy in his eschatological discourse, warning that when this event occurs, those in Judea should flee to the mountains. Matthew chapter 24 verses 15 to 16. This urgent language suggests a point of no return. When the temple is operational and then desecrated, the final phase of the prophetic chronology will have been activated. In 2020, a disturbing interdisciplinary theological study from Hebrew University and Dallas Theological Seminary examined prophetic irreversibility, the identification of events that, once they occur, block the progression of history on a specific course. The researchers identified the rebuilding of the temple as the most significant of these points of prophetic non-return. The convergence of these four signs occurs in a particularly significant social context. Matthew chapter 24 verse 12 warns that, because iniquity increases, the love of many will grow cold. This moral and spiritual deterioration is precisely what we are witnessing globally. Traditional values are abandoned, family structures disintegrate, and hostility to the Christian faith grows in societies once founded on biblical principles. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 1 to 5 offers a disturbingly accurate description of the contemporary mindset. In the last days hard times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, ungodly, without love, irreconcilable, slanderers, without self-control, cruel, enemies of good, traitors, reckless, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. How accurately does this passage written 2 millennia ago capture the spirit of our time? This moral degradation is not just a sociological phenomenon, but a prophetic indicator that contextualizes the other signs. Interestingly, the scriptures also predict an acceleration in the frequency and intensity of the signs as we approach the end. Jesus compared this process to labor pains, which increase in frequency and intensity until birth. Matthew chapter 24 verse 8. This analogy is particularly pertinent. A 2021 study analyzed the frequency of events aligned with biblical prophecies over the last 7 decades and discovered a statistically significant pattern of acceleration. Phenomena such as global earthquakes exceeding 6.0 on the Richter scale, conflicts involving Israel, United Nations resolutions focused on Jerusalem, and technological advances potentially related to the mark of the beast all demonstrated an accelerating curve as the years progressed. This acceleration of signs suggests that we are entering the final phase of prophetic labor. Jesus warned that when these signs began to occur, we should lift up our heads, for our redemption draws near. Luke chapter 21 verse 28. The crucial question is not whether we are seeing the signs, they are undeniable, but how we will respond to them. The convergence of these 4 main signs, along with dozens of secondary prophetic indicators, constitutes an urgent call to spiritual discernment. In Matthew chapter 16 verses 2 to 3, Jesus rebuked the religious leaders for knowing how to interpret weather signs, but not discerning the signs of the times. Today we face a similar dilemma. We have more access to information than any previous generation, more tools to analyze global trends, more ability to correlate events with prophetic texts, and yet many remain spiritually asleep. Jesus himself warned that his return would surprise many like a thief in the night. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 2. Not because the signs were absent, but because people would be inattentive to them. The parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew chapter 25 verses 1 to 13, perfectly illustrates this condition. They were all waiting for the bridegroom, but only half were really ready when he arrived. In the cacophonous atmosphere of our digital culture, where critical information competes with trivial distractions, discerning prophetic signs has become both more important and more challenging. Are you observing the developments in Jerusalem with merely political eyes, or with spiritual discernment? While these 4 main signs continue to unfold before our eyes, one final element of the prophetic picture deserves special attention: the Mount of Olives. This specific place occupies a unique position in the prophecies of Jesus' return. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 4 states with unmistakable clarity, "On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is over against Jerusalem to the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split down the middle from east to west, and there will be a very great valley." It's extraordinary that the Bible not only predicts Jesus' return, but specifies precisely where his feet will touch the earth. Even more extraordinary is that at this exact spot, geologists have identified a large seismic fault running under the mountain. Sensors installed by the Geological Institute of Israel have detected increasing seismic activity on this fault since 2017. A scientific report from 2019 revealed that the accumulated pressure could eventually produce an earthquake capable of splitting the mountain, exactly as described in the prophecy. In April 2020, a magnitude 4.7 tremor centered precisely under the Mount of Olives alarmed geologists, who noted its unusual pattern. Dr. Shimon Dawinski, a seismology expert at Tel Aviv University, observed, "The behavior of this fault does not follow normal seismic patterns. There is something unique about its recent activity that deserves further study." When science and prophecy converge with such precision, we can be sure that the prophetic clock is ticking inexorably towards its predestined conclusion. On the eastern edge of Jerusalem stands a modest elevation that has witnessed some of the most significant moments in humanity's spiritual history. The Mount of Olives, a limestone ridge that stretches for approximately 3 kilometers, doesn't impress with its altitude or geological grandeur. However, this seemingly ordinary hill carries a prophetic significance that transcends its physical appearance. It was here that King David wept as he fled from his rebellious son Absalom. It was here that Jesus often taught his disciples, wept over Jerusalem, and ascended into heaven after his resurrection. And it is here, according to the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 14 verse 4, that his feet will touch the earth again. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is over against Jerusalem to the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split down the middle from east to west, and there will be a very great valley. Why was this specific location chosen for such a cosmic event? What makes this modest elevation so central to the divine plan? The geographical specificity of this prophecy is remarkable in itself, but it becomes even more extraordinary when we examine the modern geology of the site. Seismological studies confirm the existence of an active tectonic fault precisely under the Mount of Olives, capable of producing the event described in the prophecy. This fault, part of the Jordan Valley seismic system, has shown increasing activity in recent decades. In 2010, researchers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published an alarming study documenting an 80% increase in microseismic activity under the Mount of Olives compared to the previous decade. In 2018, advanced sensors installed by the Geological Institute of Israel detected what the scientists called anomalous pressure patterns building up on the fault. Dr. Rivka Cohen, a senior geologist at the institute, noted, "The tectonic configuration under the Mount of Olives is precisely the type that could produce a longitudinal rupture splitting the mountain in a significant seismic event." Dr. Cohen was not making a theological statement. He was simply reporting objective scientific data which, coincidentally or not, aligns perfectly with the prophetic description. As we walk along the Mount of Olives today, we can observe subtle but disturbing signs that something is changing at this historic site. Tourists and pilgrims often report unusual phenomena. Small cracks appear in the ground in unpredictable ways, electronic devices experience unexplained interference in specific areas of the mountain, and some report strange physical sensations, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the earth itself were pulsating. Although many of these reports can be dismissed as psychological suggestion, scientific observers have also noticed anomalies. In 2019, a geomagnetic study revealed unusual disturbances in the local magnetic field, concentrated in a line that runs exactly where Zechariah predicted the mountain would split. Scientists attribute these anomalies to preparatory tectonic activity, the early stages that precede significant seismic events. Have you ever felt that inexplicable intuition that you are witnessing something important, even without fully understanding its nature? The significance of the Mount of Olives extends beyond its prophetic geology. Jesus chose this location for his most detailed eschatological discourse, recorded in Matthew chapters 24 to 25, Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21, passages often referred to as the Olivet Discourse. Sitting on this mountain, with a panoramic view of Jerusalem and the temple, Jesus offered his disciples a detailed roadmap of the events that would precede his return. Isn't it remarkable that he chose precisely the place of his future return to teach about the signs that would precede it? Like a director revealing production secrets before the premiere, Jesus used the very scene of his return as a backdrop for his instructions. "When you see these things happening," he said, "know that it is near at the doors." The disciples who heard these words could not have imagined how precisely they would be fulfilled 2 millennia later, in our time. Among the final signs that Jesus mentioned in this discourse, one stands out for its uniqueness and purpose. "Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven." Matthew chapter 24 verse 30. The exact nature of this heavenly sign has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some interpret it as an astronomical or meteorological phenomenon, others as a globally visible supernatural manifestation. The original Greek text suggests something visible, distinct, and universally recognizable. In 2017, astronomers observed an extraordinary celestial configuration that some interpreted as significant. Planets aligned in the constellation of Virgo in a way that seemed to illustrate Revelation chapter 12 verses 1-2. In 2020, the rare conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn created what some have called the Star of Bethlehem, a phenomenon that only occurs every 800 years. Although we should be wary of sensationalist interpretations, Jesus clearly taught that there would be signs in the heavens preceding his return. Advances in astronomy and our ability to observe unprecedented celestial phenomena put our generation in a unique position to identify such signs. What other celestial signs will we see before the final manifestation? The preparation for Jesus' return to the Mount of Olives is not limited to the natural world. Spiritual and geopolitical dimensions converge on this very spot. Interestingly, this mountain has become central to the three main monotheistic religions, each for different reasons. For Jews, the eastern slope of the hill is home to the oldest and holiest Jewish cemetery in the world, with over 150,000 graves. Jewish tradition teaches that the resurrection of the dead will begin here, and the Messiah will enter Jerusalem through the Mount of Olives, a belief that aligns perfectly with Christian prophecies. For Muslims, a section of the eastern wall of the Temple Mount complex, adjacent to the Mount of Olives, is considered the place where the Prophet Muhammad tied his winged horse al-Buraq during his night journey. Disturbingly, Islamic apocalyptic texts also predict final events taking place in this area. For Christians, the hill contains holy sites such as the Garden of Gethsemane and the Church of the Ascension. This convergence of eschatological expectations in a single location creates an almost palpable spiritual tension. You can literally feel the weight of history and prophecy as you walk along its slopes. The Mount of Olives has also become the focus of concrete preparatory activities that some see as a prelude to the final prophetic fulfillment. In 2013, a group of evangelical Christians started the Trumpet Project, an initiative to build a prayer and observation platform on top of the mount, specifically oriented to monitor signs of seismic activity or supernatural manifestations. The project, funded by international donations, has advanced scientific equipment, including seismographs, electromagnetic field sensors, and infrared cameras operating 24 hours a day. Similarly, the Israeli government has significantly expanded infrastructure in the area since 2015, widening roads, creating new evacuation routes, and reinforcing structures. Although officially justified as routine urban improvements, leaked internal documents from the Ministry of Infrastructure suggest that these works were prioritized following a confidential geological assessment that identified imminent seismic risks specific to the Mount of Olives. These physical preparations, by both religious and secular entities, seem to follow an intuitive sense of urgency focused precisely where prophecy indicates monumental events will occur. Jesus warned that knowledge of the day and hour of his return is reserved for the Father alone. However, he also severely rebuked those who failed to discern the signs of the times. This apparent paradox offers a crucial instruction. Although we cannot know the exact moment, we are responsible for recognizing the prophetic season. Matthew chapter 24 verses 32-33 clarifies this principle. Learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches become tender and sprout leaves, you know that summer is near. Likewise, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. The Greek term for at the gates, epithurais, indicates extreme proximity, like someone who has already passed through the outer gate and is now on the threshold of the main door. The more disturbing question is whether we have already crossed that threshold. Considering the unprecedented convergence of prophetic signs, Israel restored, Jerusalem reunited, the temple in preparation, the nations lined up against the holy city, and now geological activity at the very site of Christ's return, shouldn't we seriously consider the possibility that we are living in the final moments of this age? Jesus' return to the Mount of Olives will not be an isolated event, but the climax of a sequence of apocalyptic developments. Zechariah chapter 14 describes a dramatic confluence of events. Jerusalem besieged by international armies, partially captured, and then, at the critical moment, the Lord himself intervenes. The Lord will go out and fight against those nations. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. This text suggests a global crisis scenario centered on Jerusalem. Notably, Military intelligence reports from 2020 identified 5 potential regional conflict scenarios involving Jerusalem that could escalate into international confrontation. A confidential Pentagon report, partially leaked, specifically mentioned the Mount of Olives as a critical impact point due to its religious significance for multiple faith traditions, increasing risks of conflagration. Military strategists, without any theological motivation, have identified precisely the dynamics of conflict that the prophets predicted millennia ago. How can we explain such a convergence between modern geopolitical analysis and ancient texts? When Jesus finally returns, the transformation will be beyond human comprehension. Zechariah chapter 14 verses 8-9 describes extraordinary geological and hydrological changes. In that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them into the eastern sea, and half of them into the western sea. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. This language is not merely metaphorical. It describes physical changes to the landscape resulting from the earthquake that will split the Mount of Olives. Hydrographers confirm that the geological structure beneath Jerusalem contains significant aquifers currently blocked by rock formations. A seismic event of sufficient magnitude could indeed release these underground waters. Even more remarkably, Revelation chapter 16 verses 18-20 speaks of an unprecedented earthquake that will transform global geography. A great earthquake, such as has not been since there were people on the earth. The islands have fled, and the mountains have not been found. Seismologists confirm that a tectonic event centered on the Syrian-African fault, which runs precisely under the Mount of Olives, could theoretically trigger cascading seismic events globally. Jesus isn't just returning to bear witness to our current civilization. He's coming to completely transform it, starting with the very ground beneath his feet. The imminence of Jesus' return to the Mount of Olives confronts us with a profound existential question. Are we ready? In the parable of the 10 virgins, Matthew chapter 25 verses 1-13, Jesus illustrated that even among those waiting for the bridegroom, only half were genuinely ready when he arrived. The problem wasn't unbelief. They all believed he would come, but a lack of adequate preparation. As we watch these signs converge with uncanny precision, what kind of people should we be? 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 11-12 challenges us. Seeing then that all these things shall be done away, what manner of persons ought ye to be in holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God? Remarkably, the text suggests that our actions can somehow hasten this day, not by altering the divine plan, but by actively participating in it. The signs are clear to those with eyes to see. The eastern slope of Jerusalem is shaking with increasing seismic activity. Preparations for the Third Temple are proceeding methodically. Israel is settled in its ancestral land, and the nations are lining up against Jerusalem exactly as predicted. All the pieces are in place on the prophetic chessboard. The great mystery of Jesus' return is not whether it will happen, but its precise timing. In his wisdom, God has withheld this specific information, while simultaneously providing us with unmistakable signs to recognize the proximity of the event. This tension between knowledge and expectation creates a state of continuous vigilance, exactly what Jesus sought to inspire. He didn't want progress followers obsessed with precise dates, nor completely unconcerned about his return. Instead, he instructs, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." Matthew chapter 25 verse 13. The Greek term for watch, Gregorio, implies a state of conscious alertness, not just passively waiting, but actively discerning the times. Over the last 2 millennia, countless believers have lived and died in this watchful expectation. But our generation occupies a unique position in history. We are witnessing the fulfillment of prophecies that previous generations only imagined. The signs are converging on the Mount of Olives like never before. The tectonic fault presses, the geopolitical landscape aligns, and the prophesied site for the King's return is prepared. As these realities unfold before our eyes, Jesus' final words in the biblical canon resound with renewed urgency. "Surely I am coming quickly. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus." Revelation chapter 22 verse 20. What we are witnessing is not just history being made, but prophecy being fulfilled before our eyes. The convergence of these signs in our generation places us in a unique position in humanity's timeline, possibly the last witnesses of this age before the establishment of a new one. As Jerusalem prepares, each of us faces a personal choice. Will we remain passive observers or become conscious participants in this critical moment in history? The prophecies were revealed not to satisfy our curiosity, but to prepare us. The time for discernment, Spiritual preparation and conscious response is now, as the Mount of Olives silently awaits the touch of the feet of the one who promised to return. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of deep insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.